Hi, this is William, and welcome to another look. 1960 was a landmark year for horror cinema. It seemed that films from all over the world were invested in involving the form of the genre. While the obvious pairing of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho and Michael Powell's Peeping Tom will stick out amidst the others, they still nonetheless offered a temperature check of what audiences were craving. By this time, The Twilight Zone is floating across the airwaves, and B pictures ruled the atomic era. But 1960 brought a variety of horror staples to viewers. Italian horror master Mario Bava released his classic black and white Gothic tale Black Sunday with Barbara Steele, and Eyes Without a Face emerged from France, not to mention the rising talents of the Roger Corman Company and William Castle's Funhouse theatrical experiences. Viewing this all in hindsight, horror films were rebelling against their own history. But so were many other films beyond the spooky genre. The Apartment and La Dolce Vita found different perspectives in crushing modernism, while Godard and Antonioni began to find their own voice in the void of personal cinema. And that's just to name a few. 1960 was a year of evolution, and in concentrating on two lesser-known horror films, we can examine what elements were vital to pushing the horror picture forward. The first film is The City of the Dead, otherwise known as Horror Hotel. Directed by John Llewellyn Moxley of the Night Stalker fame, The City of the Dead was a British production that was nonetheless aimed for an American audience, even though it didn't find its way overseas until 1961. Many have likened its plot as very similar to Psycho, with a young woman visiting a creepy motel and then vanishing suddenly, while the second half focuses on her relative looking for her. But instead of Norman Bates, it's a coven of witches in a soundstage space that seemingly exists out of time. It's a cheap horror production, but it's filled with little grace notes and almost suffocating atmosphere. The fog seems to have a life of its own, and the production design is lovingly photographed. The film, as a document of the early 1960s, is very much in line with how horror aesthetics were being distilled down to their essence or tossed aside entirely. The City of the Dead practically feels like a nightmare, with little attention paid to its internal logic. Much like Black Sunday, it is representative of the Gothic film being taken to the extreme. This is something that would continue throughout the 1960s, with Roger Corman productions such as House of Usher and The Pit of the Pendulum with Vincent Price. And not to forget the famed Hammer Studios out of England, which took Gothic monster movie premises and filled them with blood and cleavage while reinterpreting well-known material. Around this time, horror forged its own way, even if some of the roots included a return to the familiarity of the monster movies of the 1930s from Universal. Hammer Studios utilized that framework for some of the most indelible versions of classic horror screen characters, such as Christopher Lee's frightening Frankenstein's monster and his cunning, almost animalistic Count Dracula. But in 1960, the same year as The City of the Dead and the year that we're analyzing, a unique Hammer film released, Brides of Dracula. Known as a sequel to Horror of Dracula that actually doesn't feature Christopher Lee in any capacity. He's only mentioned twice in the entire film. It's a splendid horror picture that focuses on the allure of a vampire's sexuality, as well as distancing itself from the masculine evil of Count Dracula. In Brides of Dracula, and many Hammer films going forward, the Gothic horror film is reshaped to provide new stories and perspectives, not just heightening the blood and sex, but also the types of narratives that audiences will receive. Directed by Terence Fisher, who is known as one of the defining auteurs of the Hammer catalog, Brides of Dracula doesn't necessarily sharpen the Gothic atmosphere down to its essence, but it finds new ways to explore that type of look and feel. Often, that involves Fisher's gorgeous direction, which moves in a musical fashion while never really being a musical. The flowing nightgowns and detailed production design is a far cry from the cheapy black and white, nightmarish quality of The City of the Dead, but they complement each other by both finding new avenues for a well-trodden genre. In conclusion, what 1960 offered as a year of horror cinema was the beginning of one path, with films like Carnival of Souls, Night of the Living Dead, and Rosemary's Baby emerging throughout the decade, while it simultaneously attempted to keep the old-fashioned Gothic spirit alive in its purest form. The City of the Dead and Brides of Dracula exemplify a tone and energy that would eventually be reclaimed by late-night horror television hosts. Their tales of graveyards and haunted castles and fog floating across the screen lost their luster throughout the decade, but the films had a last gasp of evocative images and iconic performances before fading away.